We were discussing Ritzui Tzitz in a case of Tuma on Yom Chamishi, and we had two brisos that seemed to contradict each other. According to one brisa, and this is on the top of page Yud Ches, if you have the photocopies, Ritzui Tzitz is maratza even on Tuma b'mezid. And Tuma b'mezid could apply in one of two cases, either of two cases. Either because the Kohen who was doing the avodah knew, he was well aware of the fact that he was tamei, or alternatively, the basar, he was well aware of the fact that the basar is tamei, and in both cases, there's ritzui tzitz. That's according to one brisa. The other brisa says that tzitz is not maratza unless it was bishogeg. So let's say, for example, you have a mincha that was brought on the mizbeach and it was tamei, but he was unaware of it unintentionally, then and only then is tzitz maratza. But if he was aware of the tumah, then tzitz is not maratza al hamezid. Now, all this, as we finished up on Thursday, only applies in a case of a minchas yachid. In the case of a minchas tzibur, tzitz is maratza bein b'mezid ubein b'shogeg. That was the last thing that we discussed in the previous discussion. However, we know that there are two types of karbanos. There are karbanos brought by Yisrael, and if a non-Jew brings a Kohen, he offers a pledge, a neder, and a dava, we accept his karban. In the case of a non-Jew, there is no concept called ritzui tzitz. If the karban was brought betuma, whether it was intentionally or unintentionally, makes no difference. The karban is not ola, it's possible. There's no power of ritzui tzitz ala tuma in the case of a karban, the bilam of which is a nachri. And that's a brisa that's quoted in the Sugyan Daf Chaf Hey. Now the Gemara has machlokes between Ravina and Rav Shila how to interpret that brisa. Let's begin with the case of a karban mincha that's owned by Yisrael, that's brought by Bailam Yisrael. Ravina says that whether or not the tumah was b'shogeg or b'mezid refers to what we call the irua. The irua means how was the tumah contracted? And in such a case, there's no difference between mezid and shogeg. What we said that in the case of a minchas yachid, there's only ritzui tzitz b'shogeg, according to one brisa. That distinction between shogeg and mezid does not have any bearing on how the tumah itself was contracted, but rather kol achiluku rak hakrava, namely that in mekrivo b'shogeg tzitz maratza, mekrivo b'mezid lo maratza. Now this is intuitively correct. What difference does it make whether or not he walked into a room not knowing that there was a corpse there in the room and he inadvertently contracted tumah, or he knew and he deliberately contracted tumah? That's irrelevant. Says Ravina, what's relevant is the akrava. Did he do akrava knowing full well it was tamei? What was the Kohen's level of knowledge, awareness? Or did he not know? It was unintentional. Tzitz is maratza if the Kohen was acting unintentionally. He did not know that he was being makriv something, a mincha bituma. Makes sense. Rav Shilo disagrees. Hachiluk, the distinction between shogeg and mezid, which means that we're limiting the power of tzitz to be maratza to a case of shogeg, u bituma. It's in the actual original contraction of tumah. what we call the Irua, what I mentioned before. If the Irua was Tuma B'Shogeg, then Tzitz is Maratza. If the Irua was B'Mezid, then Tzitz is not Maratza, which means that if the Irua of Tuma was B'Shogeg, Tzitz is Maratza, even if the Hakrava was B'Mezid, even according to that price that distinguishes between Mezid and Shogeg, limiting Tzitz and its power to be Maratza only to Shogeg and not to Mezid. That's because, says Rav Shilo, the Tuma itself was the distinction between Shogeg and Mezid in terms of the scope or the application of Ritzui Tzitz has nothing to do with the Hakrava itself. It's all about contracting Tumah. If the Tumah was contracted b'mezid, even if the Hakrava was b'shogeg, Tzitz is not Maratza. If the Tumah was contracted b'shogeg, even if the Hakrava was b'mezid, the Tzitz will be Maratza. According to Rav Shilo, the only determining factor as to whether the Tzitz is Maratza or not, meaning limiting the Ritzui power to Shogeg and not applying it to Mezid, is only in terms of the original Iruah of Tumah. It's not relevant, and that distinction will not apply in the Akrav itself. So the machlokas here between Ravina and Rav Shilo is min hakotza lakotza, from one polar extreme to the other. According to Ravina, the way and the manner and the circumstance under which the Kohen contracted Tumah is totally irrelevant. We're only focused on the Akrava. Was the Akrava b'mezid or the Akrava b'shogeg? It was b'mezid, ain't tzitz maratza. It was b'shogeg, tzitz is maratza. According to Rav Shilo, the question of whether the Akrava was b'mezid or b'shogeg is totally irrelevant. We're only interested in the original Kabbalah's Tumah. If the Kohen was Makabal Tumah, knowing full well that he had contracted Tumah, walked into a cemetery, then even if his Akrava later on of the Mincha was b'shogeg, he didn't realize that this Mincha was Tameh, or let's say he forgot about the fact that he himself was Tameh, nevertheless, since his original Tumah, the Ruah of the Tumah, by which he contracted Tumah, was b'mezid, ain't tzitz maratz. If on the other hand, the Ruah Tumah was b'shogeg, then even if the Hakrava was b'mezid, nevertheless the tzitz is maratz. So that's Rav Shilo. Okay. Now, we have a short discussion about Lechem Aponim. And as you know, the Lechem Aponim was organized on the Shulchan in 2 rows of 6 Lechamim on a weekly basis from Shabbos to Shabbos. And on Shavuos, we have another Mincha, which is called the Shtei Lechem. And the Mishnah quotes the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda, the Tana Rabbi Yehuda, that if one of the Mesadrei Lechem Aponim of the Sidrei Lechem Aponim was Tameh, or one of the 2 Shtei Lechems of Chag HaShavuos was Tameh, Rabbi Yehuda says something amazing. You remember the principle, Oila Rosh, Oila Shchena. Both have to be thrown out. So let's say it turns out that, he has a seder of Lechem Aponim on one side of the Shulchan, going up in the different shelves, and another seder on the other side. One of the 2 Sdarim of 6 Lechamim contracted Tumah. The other was Tar. They're all possible. Or on Chag HaShavuos, you have Shtei Lechem, only one of which contracted Tumah. The other is Tar. Nevertheless, they're both excluded. They're both disqualified. The Yotzim lebeis hasreifa, like any Kodshim shenitmu, we take it out to the beis hasreifa, chutz lemachne, and we burn it, and we will burn both Shtei Lechem, even the one that's tar, or even the Lechem Aponim that are tahorin. And why? Because ein carbon tzibur mischalik. Once a carbon is called a carbon tzibur, it's either all or nothing. There's one enterprise, one entity, and it's either all kosher or all tamei, all possible. And that's a unique principle of Rabbi Yehuda with regard to carbon tzibur. Keep in mind that both lechem aponim and shtei lechem belongs to the tzibur, obviously. Why? Because ein carbon tzibur mischalik. You can't split it. And therefore, if part of it is tummy, the whole thing is tummy. Chachamim say no. Hatame yisarev, v'hatame v'hatar ye'ochel. Now, I'll tell you what bothers my mind. Again, we're only learning this superficially. If we were learning this more be'iyun, on the one hand, the Chachamim are very empathetic, and I intuitively agree with the Chachamim. Why should you throw out the Tameh? I'm sorry, the tar. But what I don't understand is, what do the Chachamim mean when it says Hatami Yisar Fatar Ye'achel? Shtei lechem requires two lechem. If you brought one lechem instead of two, how could the carbon be kosher? Or in the case of lechem aponim, the Torah requires 12 lechamim. 6 won't do it. So if the Chachamim would have said, well, add another lechem to replace that which was tameh, then nicha, I could live with that. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can't split a carbon tzibur. Whatever you did, and it's gone. If you don't have a full carbon tzibur, it's not worth anything. So the Chacham say, no, let's maintain, let's do damage control and maintain the qualification of that lechem, which is tar. It remains qualified. Add another one, and now you have a full shtei lechem, for example. But the language here that atamei yisaref vehatar ye'achel implies that the carbon is kosher. And I don't know if he's operating within the framework of what we call ritzit sitz. The Chachamim are operating with ritzit sitz, and that's machshir the carbon. We said many times that ritzit sitz does not allow you to eat that which is tameh. So as far as achilas habasar is concerned, ritzit sitz is not effective. And therefore there's no havamina here that he could eat that lechem which contracted tumah. But as far as the carbon itself, the carbon is kosher because of ritzit sitz. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda, he says, no, you can't have ritzit sitz on half a carbon. The carbon is already completely tumah. All right. Now, Rabbosai, in our list, we set up about a week or two ago a long list of different cases of a mincha psula. Now we're going to pick up 2 other psulim. One is called lina, that's called baltosir, nosar, and the other is called the psul of yotze, meaning it went out of the azar. So let's start with lina. So we have a mincha, which means either the kometz or the shirayim, and the time allotment has passed. Let's say, for example, a mincha could be eaten on the day of the hakrava and the night thereafter, like Kodshim. The following morning, it becomes nosa. With alosa shachar, I don't know if anyone by chance was up at alosa shachar today, 4:04. I was up because I had to have breakfast today. No, I'm just kidding. I could have survived without the breakfast. Anyway, so the din is that if alos hashachar passes, the mincha now becomes nosar, and that's called a psul of lina. He says the following. Hakometz nifsal belina b'shkias acham. We're going to have to figure out exactly what the scenario is. The first stage in any carbon mincha is what we call kiddush. and you place the mincha into a kli sharis. Then obviously we're ready for kmitza. And the komets, together with the shrine, will be placed in a second kli, a kli sharis. What's going on now in our particular scenario is that there was kiddush in the first kli, and he hasn't yet done the kmitza. The day passed and the night passed. It's now alos hashachar the following morning. So he quotes Rashi. I think it's on Daf Chaf, I'm not sure, but in any event, Rashi says that over aleim alayla, liachash is kadoshu, after the kiddush and the kli, nifsolim belina balos hashachar shalayom shalamachras v'nasen nosar hakometz nifsal belina b'shkias hachama. Oh, he says the following: Kmitza has a different allotted time, the komets itself, than the shirayim. The shirayim can be eaten, and like Kodshim in general, we give him the night after the day, up until alos hashachar, to eat the shirayim, like any korban. As far as the kmitza is concerned, there's halacha of haktorah. The haktorah of kmitza must take place before shkia of the day of the kmitza. We don't have the night following. There's no kmitza during the nighttime, just like there's no avoda at night. The Beis Hamikdash is closed for business. The osa shokvar eno roy lios muktar al gabi mizbeach. From nightfall, it's already posel in mizbeach. You can't do aktar on the komets. So let's ask the following question: what's going to happen here? Are there going to be two different dinim or two different zmanim for the psul of lina? With regard to the shirayim, we're going to wait until alos hashachar the next morning. With regard to the komets, it becomes lina already with shkias hachama, with sunset. We don't wait for sunrise the next morning. He writes, mincha o shiori mincha, sha'over aleim laila, nifsolim belina balos hashachar, shalayom shalamachos v'nasim nosar. What does that mean? Does that mean that the komets itself becomes nosar the next morning? I mean, there's no possibility of haktorah of the nosar with shkias hachama. We don't have to wait till the next morning. In the next line, he says, "V'komets nifsal belina b'shkias hachama," which is exactly the case. Shekei meosa shok var eno roilios mukar gabi mizbeach. Again, we need kiddush kli, but once it's kiddush kli, then it becomes possible b'shkias hachama. Now, again, as I always apologize because I'm going to say something that's iffy. I can't prove it to you. But I would suggest that the full-fledged status of nosar with regard to the komets would be suspended and delayed until alos hashachar. We're going to take the korban mincha as a whole, has two parts, A plus B. It's got the komets and the shirayim. And just like the shirayim becomes possible with daybreak, so too the komets becomes possible with daybreak. But you'll ask me, what do you mean? Rashi says explicitly it became nosar once there was shkias hachama, because komets requires haktorah, and he didn't do the haktorah before shkias hachama. I would have to admit to you that there is a psul of lina with regard to the komets with shkias hachama, but the full-fledged psul of lina would be postponed until the morning. I'll give you a mashal of David. Let's say, for example, Rabbi Lozer ben Azariah says that the korban Pesach on the night of Pesach has to be eaten by chatzos, but it doesn't become nosar until the very next morning. Yesh me'achronim shekosav, In the footnote, he refers to the Mikdash David. I told you many times he's the kingpin on Kodshim, the Mikdash David. Shelavona she'ein ba kmitza. Now, Lavona, in certain cases, although it accompanies the mincha, it has its own, a life of its own, a mind of its own. And there's no such thing as kmitza in the Lavona. What we need is kiddush b'kli, which, if you recall, we have this large kli in which we put the mincha on one side and the lavona on the other side. So that's already kiddush kli. There's not going to be any kmitza on the lavona. There will not be any kiddush sheni b'kli sheni in the case of lavona. Nifseles belina v'shkias achama, if the lavona was put into a kli, then it becomes possible belina with shkias achama, because in the case of lavona, A, there's nothing more than akara, and B, there's no kmitza, and there's no kiddush b'kli sheni. So it does seem like, with regard to the mincha itself, forgetting about the lavona, there is a push, so to speak, a delay factor here, delaying the psul of lina until the next morning. And he's talking about the komets. He's not talking about the shirayim. That might support what I said before. I don't know. Okay. So that's what we have as far as Lavon is concerned. The Mikdash David wants to suggest that the Lavona becomes possible lina with shkia sachama. It does not have those attributes of a mincha, where you wait for kmitza and you wait for kiddush b'kli sheni, and you have shirayim that could be eaten up until alos hashachar. None of that is relevant. So kmitza, so lavona is pretty straightforward. The psul of lina is chal with shkia sacham. There's no complications. But now he gets to a case of a different lavona. You may remember that with regard to the lechem aponim, there's also an accompaniment of lavona, and that is achieved through bazichen, which are large ladles or spoons, and they dig into the lavona and they put a spoon on the side of the shtel of the lechem aponim. Now, at what point did the baziche lavona of the lechem aponim become posel mitzad lina? He says, silukam hu kimitzasam. With regard to the lechem aponim, we have a principle that replaces kmitza. I mean, the lechem aponim are baked as loaves of bread. There's no kmitza. But there is halach of siluk. Siluk means taking them off shulchan. The removal from the shulchan is like kmitza. Ha'im yesh lahem din kometz li posel b'shkias achama dafka le'achar siluk me'as shulchan o af kodem l'chei. A psul of lina could only be chal after kiddush. Kiddush generates a psul of lina. I mean, obviously, kiddush is for the purpose of bringing the carbon kedasu kedin, but it also generates the potential psul of lina. Now, in the case of baziche lavona, there is no kmitza, and therefore the law of psul lina should be dependent totally on kiddush kli. Once it's kiddush kli, If you wait till Shkias Achama, then it's possible you did Lina. But in the case of Baziche Levona, that accompany the Lechem Aponim, we have a unique halacha of Silukam Kik Mitzah. And therefore, the question is, what happens if there was Lina on Baziche Levona without Siluk? And he left the Levona on the Shulchan. He never removed it from the Shulchan. He certainly didn't take it out into the Azara. Shall we say that now there cannot be a psolina because it's premature for the psolina? Because we need the kiddush of siluk. It's the siluk me'ashulchan that substitutes for kmitza. Like, for example, let's say you had a mincha and you left it overnight, but you hadn't yet done the kmitza. There was no kiddush, even if you put it into a kli shares, and therefore there'd be no psul of lina. The psul of lina is only initiated, it's only generated when you do a full-fledged kiddush, which means not only kli shares, but kmitza. In Levona, there is no kmitza, classic Levona. And therefore, the psul of lina will be chal once it's in a kli shares, if you leave it until after Shkias Achama. But now we're talking about a different Levona, not the classic Levona, but Baziche Levona of the Lechem Aponim, where there's a special rule that Silukam, what was the language again? Silukam hu kmitzasa. Now I don't know, and again, we don't have to anticipate a second kiddush in a kli shares, a kli sheni. There's no kiddush in kli sheni. It already had the kiddush in a kli rishon, but it didn't have siluk yet. So we don't know, and the Mikdash David vacillates back and forth. Would there be a psolina before siluk if he left it on the shulchan overnight? Ha'im yesh lehem din kometz lipaso b'shkias achama, right? Just like we said that the kmitz itself, which needs hakara, it's paso with shkia. Same thing should apply to the beziche levona. Or should we say no? Dafka liachar siluka me'ashulchan. Only then does it have the din of a kmitza, and dafka then after siluk it lends itself to the psul of lina. And now we get to the psul of yotze. What are the mechitzos for any carbon? It's always going to be the mechitzos of the azara. If you take a carbon outside of the azara, that's called the psul of yotze. The same halach that applies in Kodshim. I'm sorry, I meant to say Kodshim, because Kodshim Kalim is the entire city of Jerusalem. But Kodshim become pasul biyote once they leave the ksolim, the walls of the azara. The same identical halach applies to mincha. In some sense, we're mezalzel a little bit with mincha. Mincha is only a mincha, right? It's a cheapo kind of carbon. It's an easy way out. But no. Mincha has the status of Kodshim. And here's one example of many in which if the mincha went out of the azara, like any Kodshim, it becomes possible lina. Possible yotze. Yotzu michutz azara nifsolim biyotze. Nechleku rishonim emes aichal aleim kiddush saguf leinya shei possible biyotze. Yeshe kosov. Okay, this is Rashi. Meaning outside the walls of the Azor, psula. I mean, that's intuitive. I wouldn't have dreamt it could be otherwise. Once it's Kiddush Kli, that Kiddush Kli now sets up all the psulim, including the psul of Yotze. So if after Kiddush Kli, the mincha is taken out of the Azor, it's possible. However, Osis disagrees. To Misha shenitna bekli shares, I'm sorry, rak mishas hakmitza hey nifsolos the yotze. You put the entire mincha, everything together, the entire solis into a kli shares. That's kiddush stage 1, but that's not the full culmination of the makav patish of the kiddush. The makav patish of the kiddush is the kmitza. He hasn't yet done the kmitza, How could it be possible if he takes it out of the Azara and it wasn't sanctified yet? And therefore, Tosfos says that after Kmitza, then you could talk about the psul of Yotze, but not before. Okay, I think this is where we'll stop here because I want to leave some time for Yuma. So let's